Right, so today we'll look at connective tissue. So connective tissue are of various types. Now, connective tissue is a type of tissue found in the body. It's one of the 4 basic tissues we have in the body with a major function of support and attachment. So this support comes in form of physical support as well as metabolic support. If you like, you can call it anatomical support and physiological support. So unlike epithelial tissue that we discussed earlier on, connective tissue has cells which are not firmly held together. We saw that in epithelial tissue, cells are tightly held together by intercellular junctions or connections. But in this tissue, cells are wide apart. Therefore, the space in between cells is significant. In epithelial tissue, we're saying the space is very minute, but here the space is wide, and that space in between cells, we call it the extracellular matrix. If you like, you can call it interstitial space. Now, that space is not blank. The space is filled with an aqueous environment, but this aqueous environment is in form of a jelly aqueous environment. It's not completely fluid. It is semi-fluid. Apart from that, the extracellular matrix in connective tissue is filled with various protein fibers, namely collagen fibers, reticular fibers, and elastic fibers. Therefore, we see that the main function of connective tissue is to support and attach structure. So there are various types of connective tissue. We classify them as follows. We have connective tissue proper, the actual connective tissue, composed of loose, dense connective tissue. So it is loose and dense connective tissue. Then dense connective tissue has sub-classifications shown here, regular and dense, irregular. Then we also have connective tissue with special properties or special function, or you can simply call it specialized connective tissue, under which follows adipose tissue, elastic tissue, hematopoietic tissue, this is bone marrow as we call it, and mucous tissue or mucoid connective tissue. Okay. Then we have cartilage on the other end and bone. So all these types are specialized type of connective tissue, each performing a specific function in the body. Other than attachment, they have extra functions. So today we'll just look at the properties of connective tissue in general. Now, what are these properties? Number one is tensile strength. So we see that connective tissue offers tensile strength. So tensile strength is nothing but the ability of a structure, organ, or body part to allow some degree of pulling or stretching without being damaged. And after that pulling or stretching has occurred, this organ or tissue must recoil or go back to its original position. All that property is afforded to organs and tissues because of the presence of connective tissue in them. Another property special to connective tissue is elasticity. So connective tissue facilitates the ability of organs and tissues to recoil, to go back to their original position after being pulled or compressed in a certain direction. For example, the skin can be pulled and it will go back to its original position. Okay. Then apart from that, connective tissue also offers volume to organs and tissues. We find that if you remove connective tissue from the body, the mass and substance of the body reduces. that is wet, and the bulkiness will reduce. Okay, so these are the most important properties of connective tissue. As such, connective tissue is found almost in all body organs and tissues. Okay, therefore, connective tissue is the most abundant type of tissue we have in the body. All organs, all tissues need to be attached to certain structures of the body, and we depend on connective tissue to achieve that connection or anchoring, if you want. Let's look at composition of connective tissue. What structures make up connective tissue? We saw that in epithelial tissue, the composition was simply cells. These cells were resting on a basement membrane. So that's the composition of epithelial tissue. Apart from that, the cells were held firmly together by intercellular junction. That's another composition of epithelial tissue. Now, let's take a look at connective tissue. So number one, connective tissue is composed of cells. Like all tissues, we need cells anyway. Then we said these cells are apart. They are not held together like in epithelial tissue. And the space in between them is filled by extracellular matrix, what we call interstitial space. That space is occupied by protein fibers. Those fibers are listed here: elastic fiber, collagen fiber, and reticular fibers. Apart from the fibers, we have what we call the ground substance. So the ground substance, like I was explaining, is in form of a jelly. It is not solid, neither is it completely fluid. It is semi-solid or semi-liquid, if you like. Right now, before I go any further, I want us to observe that elastic fibers, in terms of size, they are almost equivalent to reticular fibers. These are elastic, these are reticular. The only difference is how these fibers will be arranged. If we take a closer look on reticular fibers form a mesh. You see that the fibers here are intertwining each other. They are more like weaving, forming a weave. So we call that as reticular fiber. Whereas elastic fibers do not weave, rather they form branches. So we see one strand here branching off, and that is the arrangement of reticular fibers. So I hope simzanipangira chongo manje because so mkazikamba pangono. All right, so these are elastic fibers. We're saying elastic fibers are branching, whereas reticular fibers form a meshwork or a weave, if you like. So these are the three components of connective tissue: connective tissue cells, connective tissue fibers, and connective tissue ground substance, all shown here in the diagram. This is collagen, the largest fibers of connective tissue. Then the minute ones are elastic and reticular. So elastic are intermediate in terms of size. They are larger than reticular. So reticular are the smallest ones we have. Then we see that there are several types of cells here. For example, this is a macrophage. That is a fibroblast. This is a goblet cell. And this one is a mesenchymal cell. Now, mesenchymal cells are stem cells. Stem cells are cells which have not yet acquired specialization. They don't know yet whether they will become accountants, mechanicals, doctors, nurses, or whatever. Therefore, they have the ability to be transformed in any type of cell. They can be specialized to become macrophage, to become adipocytes, or indeed fibroblasts. So these are cells of reserve to replace any dying cells of connective tissue. Now let's look at types of cells found in connective tissue. So we start breaking down these components one by one. We say the components are 3: cells, fibers, and ground substance. So we start with cells, we'll go to fibers, then eventually finish up with ground substance. So let's begin with cells as the first component of connective tissue. So cells of connective tissue are broken down into two broad categories. We have what we call wandering cells and resident cells. Resident cells, these are cells that we are going to find in connective tissue at any given time. So they are permanent cells of connective tissue. Then wandering or transient cells, these are cells that are found in connective tissue only in special circumstances. Most cases is when there's infection in tissues. That's when the wandering or transient cells will migrate from blood into connective tissue. Therefore, all wandering cells are simply cells from blood, white blood cells to be specific. So let's begin looking at them one by one, starting with the resident or what you call permanent cells of connective tissue. So they are as follows. Connective tissue at any given time, you're going to find fibroblasts. Fibroblasts are the principal cells of connective tissue. These cells are said to be star-shaped. You see that there is one central part, the body, then the body has several processes. This is a fibroblast. Apart from that, we also have special type of fibroblasts, which we call myofibroblasts. So these are cells which have dual property. They have muscular function. At the same time, they have fibroblastic function. Fibroblasts are the cells that are secreting the ground substance and the fibers. That's why we call them principal cells. Fibroblasts will produce elastin fibers, collagen fibers, and reticular fibers. At the same time, they secrete the ground substance. So without fibroblasts, we cannot form connective tissue. Hence the name principal cells. Now, the myofibroblasts resemble fibroblasts, but they also have some actin and myosin filaments in their cytoplasm and therefore have the ability to contract and relax. These cells are essential during wound healing. When the skin is cut, abrased, lacerated, or whichever term we want, there's separation in epithelial tissue and connective tissue. Now, to bring those separate edges closer to each other, we depend on myofibroblasts. When these cells contract, they pull the separate edges of the wound together. So they are more like sutures. These are natural sutures we have in the body. But if the wound is too wide, you need artificial sutures now. That's when you take patients to theaters or simply OPD and suture them. Macrophages. These are macrophages here. These are the largest cells in the white blood cell population. That's what we call the macro. These are scavengers and will engulf anything that is foreign or dying in the body. They eat and destroy anything that is foreign or odd in the body. Then we have adipocytes. Adipocytes are these yellow cells shown here. These are fat cells. They store fat, and fat is a source of energy for the body. Then mast cells. Mast cells are immune cells. They are there to fight off specific type of foreign microorganisms, usually seen in parasitic and hypersensitivity reactions. When there's parasitic infection in the body, we depend so much on mast cells and basophils to remove the such kind of infection, worm infection, basophils. Now, apart from having these cells, fibroblasts, myofibroblasts, macrophages, adipocytes, we also have stem cells, which we are calling here as mesenchymal cells. So those are the permanent cells. What about the transient ones? Transient cells, these are wandering cells, cells that will just be found in connective tissue in special circumstance, like I was saying, during infection. If there's no infection in connective tissue, most likely you won't find these cells. Number one, lymphocytes. There are two types, B and T lymphocytes. We also have plasma cells. Plasma cells are simply activated B lymphocytes. So these are cells that are actively producing antibodies or immunoglobulins. Then we have neutrophils. Neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. These belong to one population of white blood cells. We call them granulocytes. These cells are loaded with chemicals that are very lethal towards any foreign cell or antigen. When those chemicals in their cytoplasm are released, we call that process as degranulation. So neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils undergo what we call degranulation, more like releasing their chemicals against foreign cells. If those chemicals are produced in large quantities, the body becomes affected as well. We call that hypersensitivity reaction, or what we call allergy. Then the last population of cells that will be found in connective tissue only in specific time are monocytes. Now, monocytes are cousins with macrophages. They come from the same parents, monoblast. So monoblast will give us macrophage and monocytes. The only difference is that macrophages are found in tissues, whereas monocytes are found in blood. But the function is the same. Engulf and destroy any foreign cell or dying cells. So they are scavengers. So those are the cell types we expect to find in connective tissue. Wandering cells or transient cells, all of them originating from blood. Then permanent cells. Among them is a principal cell known as fibroblast. Let's look at them one by one. So we begin with fibroblasts, the principal cells. So what is the function of fibroblasts here? Fibroblasts are the cells that build connective tissue. So they secrete collagen, they secrete elastin and reticular fibers. On top of that, they produce what we call ground substance. Now, what makes up ground substance? Ground substance is made up of the following molecules. GAGS is an abbreviation. This is glycosaminoglycans. Glycosaminoglycans, we abbreviate it as GAG. Then proteoglycans and glycoproteins. These are the major elements of ground substance. I said this is a jelly-like structure. Okay. Now, in this image, we see these nucleus. These are the nucleus of fibroblasts. And these purple wavy structures. These wavy structures are simply the collagen fibers and elastic fibers. Then these are now, if you see the distance between cells is wide, we didn't see such in epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue cells are held together by intercellular junctions, but here cells are wide apart. So these are fibroblasts with flat nuclei, because these cells are said to be star-shaped. If you look at this, the nucleus is flat, but the body of the cell is more like a star. Now, we have two types of fibroblasts. Two types of fibroblasts. We have mature fibroblasts and immature fibroblasts. Or you can call them active fibroblasts and quiescent or dormant fibroblasts. Now, the immature fibroblasts are what we call active fibroblasts, whereas the dormant or quiescent fibroblasts are the old fibroblasts. So let's begin with a young fibroblast. So young fibroblasts are the active cells that produce connective tissue. They produce the fibers, they also produce the ground substance. So you find that in terms of size, the young fibroblasts have a large nucleus, and the entire cytoplasm stands highly because it has high number of rough endoplasmic reticulum. To produce protein, we need rough endoplasmic reticulum because that's the organelle responsible for production of proteins that are useful outside the cell. Proteins used inside the cell are produced by 3 ribosomes. So that's a major difference. You see young fibroblasts with a large nucleus, and the entire cytoplasm is highly stained. For example, this cell here, these are young fibroblasts. Then old fibroblasts, to differentiate them, we call them fibrocytes, or you can simply call them quiescent or dormant fibroblasts. Okay, so fibrocytes are simply odd fibroblasts, and these are inactive, so they don't produce anything, and they have less amount of rough endoplasmic reticulum, and their cytoplasm is not as highly stained as the young fibroblasts. So you see them being smaller in size, like here. These are old fibroblasts. They've done their work. They're just now there to help maintain the tissue. Okay. Those are the 2 major types. Check for me more examinations. No, I'm supposed to invigilate for Mrs. Gadanda. But once they start, then I'll join in that. Just make sure that I am, by examinations. Thanks, Dad. Okay, thanks. So that's about the 2 types of fibroblasts. So when we say fibroblast, in its strict definition, we are talking about active fibroblasts. When you say fibrocyte, we are talking about inactive fibroblasts. Those are the 2 differences. Just like you and I, when you are young, you are very active and building up your future. When you're old, you have to rest and enjoy life. That is what the old fibroblasts are doing. They're just there to maintain connective tissue. Myofibroblasts, I explained the function. These cells are essential in wound healing to bring back the separate tissues so that the wound can close up. Without these cells, you find that wound healing is delayed, and therefore all those large wounds, you have to suture them so that the process of healing is faster. Okay, if you cut yourself with a razor blade, that will be a very clean cut, and you don't need the suture. The body will suture itself. You see that the following day, day 2, day 3, you see the wound is put, the skin around that area is tight. It's because of these cells that have come in and sutured the injured structure. So these are natural sutures in our body. I won't waste so much time on that. Let's focus on adipocytes. Now, adipocytes are simply fat cells. So fat cells are essential in connective tissue because the fibroblasts will need energy. The myofibroblasts will also need energy. So we need energy to be readily available even when the person is starving. And that way, we have special type of cells called adipocytes. Now, adipocytes are fat cells, as we are seeing here. So this is one adipocyte, another one, another one, another one. So what is happening here is that this cell, the cytoplasm, is used as a storage site for fat. So all the organelles of the cells are pushed to one side, and then the entire cytoplasm, instead of being filled with cytoplasm and by cytosol and other organelles, it is actually now filled with fat globules. And that's why you see that the nucleus is only in one position. Instead of being in the center here, the nucleus is pushed to the periphery. That's the nucleus, that's the nucleus, That's a nucleus here. So because of this arrangement, the adipocyte is also known as a signet cell. Signet in Latin means engagement ring, a ring. In Latin is signet. So they say a fat cell looks like an engagement ring with a band here. So this will be the band of the ring. And then the nucleus here representing the stone seen on engagement ring. So that's the major function of adipocytes in connective tissue. Store as much fat as possible that will be used as fuel for these other cells. Let's look at macrophages. Now, macrophages are shown well here in this structure. This is a macrophage, the largest cell in connective tissue. So this cell is large for simple reason, because this cell must have the capacity to engulf other cells. So it must be large. Apart from that, the cell is also filled with high number, excuse me, high number of lysosomes. Lysosomes, when we're discussing cells, we saw that these are organelles that store hydrolytic enzymes. Those enzymes have one function: destroy anything that the body doesn't want. So lysosomal enzymes are used to destroy foreign cells and dying cells, the process known as phagocytosis. And the major cell of phagocytosis in the body is macrophage. And since connective tissue is found in all organs and tissues, and all organs and tissues can become infected, it is therefore the responsibility of macrophages in that tissue to destroy those foreign microorganisms. That's about the macrophage. Remember where it is coming from. It's coming from the bone marrow as monoblast. Now, when monoblasts leave the bone marrow, they circulate in blood as monocytes. When these monocytes migrate from blood vessels into tissues, that's when we can now call them as macrophages. All right. So I'm going to pass to the students. Thanks, Mda. So when monocytes enter any type of tissue, the name changes to macrophages. Now, what happens is that once they enter tissue, the monoblast, they enlarge and therefore lose the ability to go back into blood vessels and therefore remain trapped in tissues. And therefore, you don't find macrophages in blood, but you can find monocytes in blood as well as in connective tissue. But once they enter connective tissue, the monocytes are quickly converted into macrophages. What other cell do we have? We have mast cell. Now, mast cells, like I was saying, are also cousins with basophils. Remember the transient cells? On the transient cells, we had granulocytes. Among them is neutrophil, eosinophil, and basophil. So this basophil is a cousin to mast cell. So when a basophil leaves blood vessels and enters tissues, the name changes to mast cell and the function becomes highly modified. Okay, so equivalent to basophil will be found in blood, but when crosses in tissues become mast cell. So what is a mast cell doing? Mast cell has granules in their cytoplasm, so it is also a granulocyte. It has granules in its cytoplasm, and those granules have lethal chemicals, like I said. Namely, we are talking about heparin. So heparin is an anticoagulant. It prevents blood clotting. Apart from that, mast cell also have what we call histamines. Okay. Histamines attract other cells of immune system towards an affected tissue. So these histamines, when released by mast cells, you find that there will be increased migration of cells from blood into that tissue that is affected, where histamine has been secreted by mast cells. Apart from that, mast cells also produce what we call prostaglandins. Prostaglandins are essential on smooth muscles. They act on smooth muscles so that the smooth muscles can relax. Then also, mast cells produce leukotrienes. So leukotrienes are chemicals that attack foreign cells, foreign microorganisms, and destroy them. So you see that these cells are ready for any foreign cells that will find themselves in connective tissue. And therefore, these cells are inflammatory cells, cells of inflammation or immune cells, if you like. Okay. So a mast cell closely resembles a granulocyte, and sometimes it's difficult to know which one is which. But in this case, we are lucky because we just have mast cell. So this is a mast cell. Now, take note that this pale area is representing the nucleus. Then the bluish area here is representing the cytoplasm. So we see that the entire cytoplasm of mast cell is filled with granules, and these granules have histamine, heparin, leukotrienes, and prostaglandins. The same structure will be seen for basophil. So a basophil will look like this, just like a mast cell. So this is a very essential cell in connective tissue. Now, you've heard of individuals who are allergic to certain, food, for example, fish, others allergic to peanut, and so on and so forth. What happens when those persons eat the same product that they're allergic to is there will be over-secretion of those chemicals I've mentioned, heparin, histamine, prostaglandins, and leukotrienes by mast cells. Now, because these cells have produced those chemicals in exaggerated quantities, what will happen is that this person will undergo a hypersensitivity reaction where the whole body now is alerted to say they are under attack. So blood vessels will dilate in both peripheral and central structures, and you see the whole body swollen, the face swollen, the hands and the legs swollen. When actually this person just ate fish, why should the whole body be alerted like that? We call that as hypersensitivity reaction. So all hypersensitivity reactions, or allergies, if you like, are a product of overreacting mast cells. Okay. So that is a mast cell here, shown, nucleus. And then you see these small droplets. These are vesicles filled with heparin, histamines, and leukotrienes together with prostaglandins. This is a mast cell. Let's look at lymphocytes. So lymphocytes are of two types. We have T and B lymphocytes. T and B lymphocytes. Now, these cells are small. They are very small. I don't have a picture of them here. And we'll discuss them much under blood. Okay. Okay, they are shown here. This is a lymphocyte there. This is a mast cell. Mast cell in red. These are lymphocytes. Now, lymphocytes, and in this image, it's very difficult to differentiate which one is a B lymphocyte, which one is a T lymphocyte. For that, you need special chemicals to stain them. Then that's when you can now know this is a T and this is a B lymphocyte. Otherwise, they all have the same basic structure, so they appear like one and the same. So they are very small in size. Okay, but essential in fighting infection. So T and B lymphocytes help the immune system in different ways. B lymphocytes fight off infection by producing antibodies, but T lymphocytes react to infection by attacking the microorganism or the foreign cells directly. So that's a major difference. Now, T lymphocytes are produced in small populations. Those populations, we call them clusters. So each group, more like intakes, in colleges or university, you have intakes. You may have January intake, you may have July intake. So if it's lymphocytes, we'll call them clusters. We'll not call them intakes. So we call them clusters of differentiation. Okay. So each T lymphocyte is assigned to a certain cluster or a certain intake. So because of that, T lymphocytes have CD4 numbers or cluster of differentiation numbers. You hear of CD4 cells, CD8 cells, CD6 cells. CD simply standing for cluster of differentiation or simply intake. So you have a 4 intake, 8 intake, and 6 intake. Of importance are the CD4 intake or CD4 cluster. It's because from this intake, we have a special type of lymphocyte known as CD4 T helper cell. That type of cell is essential because it acts as a coordinator of the immune system. So if that cell is removed from the immune system, then the activity of B and T lymphocyte is not well coordinated, and therefore the immune system is said to be compromised. Specifically, the HIV virus targets that population of cells, the CD4 T helper cells, reduces their number and weakens the immune system. Then we find that other microorganisms take advantage of the immune system because the T and B lymphocytes are not working together. They don't know what the other type of cells are doing, and therefore the immune system is weakened. And you hear patients who are HIV positive going for CD4 count because we are worried with that number. If those numbers fall below the normal range, immune system definitely is at risk. Good afternoon. Where is Madam Gadan? She's not in school today. So who is I'll come in. Because let me just finish this lecture. What time is it now? I told Mr. Piri to be with you. Piri. Oh, okay. I'm coming. All right. Let me end here now.